Ronnie James Dio is a timeless metal icon. His voice pierced the darkness like a thunderclap, bearing stories of warriors and lost souls and unfailing dreams. Dio's devil horns left an enduring impression on heavy metal culture and were more than just a performance gesture. Dio was more than just a singer, he was the author of the epic rock and roll stories, capturing the unwavering spirit of the warriors he sang about. After the Ozzy Osbourne era, he brought Black Sabbath back to life, created captivating songs with Rainbow, and went on to establish a successful business under his own name. However, every brightness has a shadow. Even if Dio's voice was still as strong as the fires of hell, fate threw him into his last conflict, from which no one can ever truly recover. The only enemy Dio was unable to beat was stomach cancer. However, his songs, his symbolism, and the steadfast faith of millions of devotees continue to honor him long after his passing. What shaped Dio's personality? What made him unique among the multitudes of rock singers? How did a Portsmouth guy from a tiny village rock the world? Let's take a trip to discover more about the life of Ronnie James Dio, a legend who will always be remembered. Childhood. Ronald James Padavona was a regular youngster growing up in a working-class Italian-American household with unnamed goals before he became Ronnie James Dio, before his voice reverberated through enormous venues, and before the devil horns became the iconic emblem of heavy metal. Dio was born in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, on July 10, 1942, and grew up in a conventional home with rigorous rules. His parents, who were immigrants from Italy, had high standards for their son and an unwavering work ethic. They supported hard labor, education, and most importantly, starting from nothing. However, young Ronald soon came to understand that people who merely followed the route that was set before them did not belong in this world. He demonstrated an acute sensitivity to music at a young age. However, the first instrument he picked up was a trumpet rather than a guitar or a microphone. Ronald committed himself to learning it, becoming one of the best students in his school since his family thought it would give him a secure future. He was unaware of one thing, though, and neither was anyone else. He had never touched an instrument that could match the strength of his voice. Dio went to Cortland High School in New York when he was a teenager. He spent the most of his time engrossed in music, while his peers were preoccupied with football games and weekend parties. Dio was aware that he was a part of the growing rock and roll movement. Ronald Padavona started to dream of burning stages like Little Richard and Elvis Presley rocked the world, but he would have to travel a longer path than anyone could have ever imagined to get there. He started his first band, the Vegas Kings, with an ever-increasing zeal. Later, it changed its name to Ronnie and the Rumblers, and then to Ronnie and the Redcaps. At this point, Ronald James Padavona vanished, giving way to the person the world would eventually know. Dio, Ronnie James. The path to fame was never simple. He initially planned to study medicine in college, but he quickly came to the conclusion that a soul destined for music could never be contained by textbooks. He left college to pursue what he felt was his genuine calling, defying the expectations of his family. Dio was prepared to write the first chapter of his illustrious tale, having gone from being a trumpet player in a school band to a rebellious young man who dared to forego a stable future in favor of rock and roll. However, he had no idea that the path ahead would include not only the dazzling lights of the stage but also treachery, heartbreaking failures, and decisions that would change his life. Ronnie James Dio was on the verge of entering hell as its gates opened. Early in his career, Ronnie James Dio gradually discovered his calling as rock music gained popularity. In contrast to the lucky celebrities who became famous overnight, Dio's path was paved with years of unrelenting practice, experimentation, failure, and perseverance. He was not intended to become a legend, nor did he have a spectacular beginning. All he had was a voice that the world had never heard before, and an unwavering passion. Dio, whose real name is Ronald Padavona, began playing bass in the band Ronnie and the Redcaps in the late 1950s. They performed simple rock and roll songs that encapsulated the zeitgeist, but Dio soon saw that he could not stay in the background. His voice began to come through as the band started recording its first singles. His career's first recorded notes were found in the 1958 song Lover, but it was insufficient. Dio aspired to make music that was exclusively his own, not merely to follow the rock and roll trend. The group changed its name to the Electric Elves by the 1960s. Indicated a change from rock and roll to blues rock when it was eventually abbreviated to ELF. Dio started to establish himself at this period not only as a singer but also as a musical storyteller. In addition to force and resonance, his voice has a unique depth. With each note, Dio told stories and created vivid imagery in addition to singing. Elf was able to establish a modest but expanding reputation in the music industry thanks to this distinctive trait, opening doors to more expansive prospects. The decision to choose ELF as the opening act for Deep Purple's tours marked a sea change. This was an opportunity for any up-and-coming band to get in front of more people, but for Dio, it was a turning point. He was more than just a vocalist on stage when he stood in front of thousands of enthralled admirers. He was a force that demanded attention. The audience wasn't the only ones who paid attention. One individual, Ritchie Blackmore, the renowned guitarist for Deep Purple, was especially mesmerized by his voice. Unlike other musicians, Blackmore was unique. He was not easily impressed, conceited, and famously hard to please. However, he realized he had discovered something remarkable as soon as he heard Dio sing. A voice that had never been heard before. A sound capable of reviving old stories. A voice that will sing of warriors, evil, and souls who have been cursed. Blackmore had been looking for precisely this, and it was at this point that Dio's destiny took an unforeseen turn. Blackmore quit Deep Purple shortly afterward because of internal strife. He desired to form a band that was wholly original to him, more mystical, more powerful, and unrestricted by artistic limitations. And Dio was the only one who could assist him in realizing this idea. Rainbow was created as a result, and Dio's voice would no longer be limited to little stages. Hard rock and heavy metal would enter a new age as it thundered like a storm. However, was this his last stop or just a new phase in a journey full of obstacles, betrayals, and unfulfilled hopes? Blackmore chose members of ALF to make his first album in 1975, although the band was only ever intended to be a short-term instrument. Dio was all that Blackmore really cared about. Dio was more than just a singer to him. He had the ability to make myths come to life. Dio brought something completely new to a rock world that was still dominated by themes of society, love, and revolt. Mythology, cursed dreams, and conflicts between light and darkness. When Rainbow's first album, Ritchie Blackmore's Rainbow, was released in 1975, Dio's voice instantly took center stage. Songs like Man on the Silver Mountain and The Temple of the King were more than just rock tunes. They exuded a sense of mystery and a sense of entering a different world where magic, fate, and old gods were in charge. Dio had at last found a location where his voice could really shine, and Blackmore had found the ideal vocalist. However, this was just the start. Rising, 1976, was a proclamation, if their debut album was an experiment. Dio and Blackmore were at their best on this album, producing music that was not only strong but also cinematic, resembling an epic story come to life. A prime example was Stargazer, one of the best hard rock masterpieces. The song narrates the tale of a powerful sorcerer who orders thousands of slaves to construct a tall building so he might reach the heavens, only to discover that all of his strength is useless in the face of fate. This was more than simply a song now. Dio was the one who gave it life. It was a tragic story told via music. Rainbow was no longer merely Blackmore's side project after Rising. Dio was at the center of it all, and it had grown to be a powerful force. However, this was also where the first fissures showed up. Dio was more than simply the voice behind a great guitarist as Rainbow expanded, and Blackmore wasn't the type of person who liked sharing the limelight with others. He was now a celebrity in his own way. Always wanting complete control, Blackmore began to feel nervous. While Dio intended to maintain the majesty and mystique of their early albums, he wanted Rainbow to take a more commercial, radio-friendly path. Following the release of the album Long Live Rock and Roll in 1978, the unspoken conflict between their two enormous egos peaked. With songs like Gates of Babylon, this record was yet another huge hit, but Dio and Blackmore's creative disagreements were now irreconcilable. One of the most memorable periods in both of their careers came to an end when Dio ultimately decided to leave. However, anyone who believed that Dio's career was over was mistaken. Because a new chance that would propel him to even higher heights was waiting for him as soon as he left Rainbow. Dio was about to enter the most important game of his life, and Black Sabbath was waiting. Black Sabbath's success. Many people questioned whether Ronnie James Dio's departure from Rainbow was a step backward. Ritchie Blackmore, a legendary guitarist, had been his ideal platform. However, destiny did not allow Dio to stay in the shadows for too long since, just as Rainbow's door closed, a bigger one opened. Sabbath in Black. Black Sabbath was disintegrating, and the 1970s were coming to an end. With albums like Master of Reality and Paranoid, the band, who were once pioneers, had defined heavy metal. However, internal strife was causing them to crumble after 10 years of supremacy. Countless nights spent drenched in drugs and drink. The voice that had made Black Sabbath famous, Ozzy Osbourne, had changed. Their live performances were rife with errors, and recording sessions had devolved into chaos. The band then took a risk in 1979 that nobody believed they would take. Ozzy Osbourne of Black Sabbath was dismissed. However, it wasn't the most difficult part to fire their legendary frontman. The true difficulty lay in locating a suitable substitute. It was then that Tony Iommi looked to Dio. At the house of a common friend, Sharon Arden, daughter of Black Sabbath manager and later Ozzy's wife Dawn Arden, Iommi and Dio first got to know each other. They performed together in the studio shortly after. And all doubts disappeared as soon as Dio opened his mouth. He didn't have Ozzy's voice at all. It wasn't gloomy and untamed like a drugged-out lunatic. Rather, it was a razor-sharp blade that sliced through the darkness, more formidable than anything Black Sabbath had ever encountered. Black Sabbath wanted to do more than merely survive with Dio in the lineup. They succeeded in regaining their throne. Their debut album with Dio, Heaven and Hell, was released in 1980. And it wasn't merely a return. It was a declaration. There was still Black Sabbath. They were recently reborn. It was evident from Neon Night's opening notes. The Black Sabbath of the past has changed. More importantly, their music had a fresh spirit and was sharper and more powerful. Heaven and Hell, the album's title tune, rose to prominence as one of the best heavy metal songs ever. The lengthy, melancholy dirges about death and misery from the Australian era were no longer present. This was a grand epic, a conflict between light and darkness, heaven and hell, exactly the kind of universe Dio had been singing about since his Rainbow days. Dio did more than just sing. He used his tremendous voice to take Black Sabbath from a band on the verge of dissolution back into an unstoppable force, turning every word into a war and every note into a prophecy. More copies of Heaven and Hell were sold than any other Black Sabbath album since Sabotage in 1975. Dio solidified his reputation as a genuine legend, and the band regained its divine status. However, every brightness has a shadow. Tensions between Dio and the other members of Black Sabbath started to simmer even after the band rose to prominence again. The band's subsequent album, Mob Rules, 1981, was equally as impactful as Heaven and Hell, but the fissures were already visible. Dio was a strong-willed leader, but Black Sabbath was a machine that had operated independently for more than 10 years. Dio was more than simply the band's new vocalist. Geezer Butler and Tony Iommi were unable to accept that he had become a star. The band was getting ready to release their live album, Live Evil, when things reached a breaking point. Dio has consistently refuted the accusation that he broke into the studio to change the vocal mix and raise his voice above the music. But trust between Dio and Black Sabbath had been destroyed, regardless of the truth. When Dio quit Black Sabbath in 1982, he formed a new band with drummer Vinny Appice. Dio Black Sabbath, which would eventually take on his own identity, once again descended into chaos. Even though they switched up their vocalists, including replacing Dio with Ian Gillan from Deep Purple, they were never able to regain their prior success. In the meantime, Dio, the best chapter of his career, was about to begin. Ronnie James Dio and Holy Diver were on their way. Was prepared to establish his own empire. Dio, Holy Diver, and beautiful independence for the band. It was never Ronnie James Dio's style to give up. He left Black Sabbath because he didn't want to be in anyone's shadow, not because he didn't succeed. Dio didn't turn around as he left one of the best bands in metal history. He eagerly anticipated writing a fresh chapter in his own name. Dio brought drummer Vinny Appice, who had collaborated with him on Mob Rules while he was a member of the Black Sabbath, to his new band, Dio, in 1982. Dio knew he needed more, though. He sought a guitarist who could create emotionally charged, grandiose, and powerful music. At that point, he came across Vivian Campbell, a young, gifted guitarist who was just waiting for his big break. He brought up Jimmy Bain, a former Rainbow bandmate, to play bass. The groundwork was laid, and Dio was formally established. Dio didn't waste any time. He realized that his debut album would be the foundation of his solo career, so he and his bandmates jumped right into the studio to make it. And he didn't let us down because the metal world was permanently altered by the publication of that album. Holy Diver was released to the globe on May 25, 1983. It was immediately apparent that this was no typical metal record. It was a proclamation. Stand Up and Shout, an intense, high-energy song that conveyed Dio's message clearly, launched the album. Get up and yell. Declare your identity to the world. This was not Black Sabbath's grim future. The emergence of a new force in metal was a battle cry. Holy Diver followed. Like tidal waves, Vivian Campbell's guitar riffs screamed. And Dio's famous, ethereal, and powerful vocals turned the song become one of the best heavy metal anthems ever. There was more to the lyrics than a tale of a hero who was sacrificed. They stood for sacrifice, fate, and the invisible powers that lurk in the shadows. However, Holy Diver was more than a single hit song. One of Dio's most well-known songs, Rainbow in the Dark, demonstrated that he was not only a master of mythological storytelling but also capable of writing immortal anthems that people all around the world would sing along to. Dio's soul was represented in each of the album's songs. This is a sobering yet potent warning: avoid talking to strangers. Feeling caught between fate and freedom is known as caught in the middle. Invisible. Holy Diver was more than just a hit record, it was a daring statement that Dio was never a normal man. It was turned into a memorial. It went platinum when it was released, making Dio one of the biggest solo metal legends. After being compelled to leave Black Sabbath, he went on to create his own empire. Dio was at the top. However, staying at the summit is never simple. Holy Diver's success gave Dio new opportunities, but it also presented him with difficulties he had never encountered before. His album The Last in Line, which came out in 1984, was just as successful and intense as Holy Diver. We Rock, Mystery, and the title track solidified Dio's position as a formidable force in heavy metal. Internal tensions, however, started to surface behind the scenes. As Dio gained more authority over the band, Vivian Campbell, the guitarist who had been instrumental in Dio's ascent, began to feel marginalized. Minor misunderstandings turned into a full-fledged conflict over money and artistic issues. Campbell left the band around 1986. Although Craig Goldie, his replacement, introduced a Sacred Heart, 1985, and Dream Evil, 1987, were never able to replicate the same enchantment of Holy Diver or The Last in Line. Although Dio continued to create and struggle, the metal scene was evolving. The scene changed with the advent of thrash metal, which was dominated by bands like Metallica, Megadeth, Slayer, and others. Dio refused to go away even though he was no longer at the center of the metal universe. Then, an unforeseen possibility to work with Black Sabbath again and finish the unfinished plot presented itself. Dio was set to rejoin the band that had expelled him, but would things be different this time? Private life. Ronnie James Dio was a heavy metal god on stage. With a voice that could cut through the night, he led thousands of rock fans and commanded the darkness. However, after the crowds had subsided and the guitars had stopped playing, he was once again just a regular guy who loved his family, his pets, and the basic things in life. Dio was never the careless, ostentatious kind of rock star. He didn't surround himself with sensational, short-lived loves or never-ending parties. Conversely, he was a loyal and dedicated man. In the 1960s, he married Loretta Berardi for the first time. She supported him in the early stages of his career, when he was still playing tiny tours and having trouble with health. They adopted a son together during this time, but their estrangement from one another increased as Dio's career took off. Their relationship gradually deteriorated due to the demands of the music industry, lengthy recording sessions, and frequent touring. In 1972, they ultimately made the decision to split up. Dio met Wendy Walters a few years later. She would go on to become both his wife and his most significant professional collaborator. Wendy wasn't the type of lady who stayed in her husband's shadow. She was ambitious, smart, and strong, contributing significantly to Dio's ascent to solo fame following his departure from Black Sabbath. After they were married in 1978, Wendy took over as Dio's official manager, managing the band, taking care of his finances, and turning the Dio name into a heavy metal force. Wendy and Dio stayed together until his last days, despite the fact that many people were afraid that combining love and business would cause their relationship to fall apart. They were a team, not just a husband and wife. And an unbreakable team. Dio did not live an opulent lifestyle like many rock stars of his time did. He didn't party too much, buy extravagant automobiles, or spend extravagantly on enormous residences. Instead, he favored a low-key, peaceful life, spending most of his leisure time engaging in basic hobbies like reading, gaming, and pet care. Dio was very fond of cats. In interviews, he frequently discussed his love for his many feline friends. He could spend a whole day at home reading books about mythology or science fiction, playing with his cats, and losing himself in his own universe if he wasn't recording or touring. He was also a huge movie buff, particularly of the fantasy and science fiction genres. This explains why magical and otherworldly aspects were consistently present in his lyrics. As though every song was a segment of a huge, epic film that Dio had imagined. The Last Years and the Fight Against Disease. Ronnie James Dio never stopped making music, putting his all into it, and being prepared for new challenges despite spending decades at the top of the heavy metal scene. However, it's possible that he never imagined that his last conflict would be for his life rather than music. In 2006, Dio formed Heaven and Hell, a new Black Sabbath band that included the same lineup that recorded the iconic Heaven and Hell album in 1980, with his old bandmates Vinny Appice, Geezer Butler, and Tony Iommi. The name change was intentional. Dio didn't need that moniker to establish himself, and the band didn't want to use the Black Sabbath name without Ozzy Osbourne. Heaven and Hell soon made their way into the studio, and in 2009 they produced The Devil You Know, a dark, heavy, and unquestionably strong piece of doom metal. Dio's voice was still able to shake the underworld at the age of 66, as evidenced by songs like Bible Black and Fear. The group scheduled a lengthy global tour for 2009 and 2010. However, destiny had other ideas. While Heaven and Hell were enjoying a triumphant comeback in the middle of 2009, Dio started to suffer from chronic stomach pain. He dismissed it at first. He was accustomed to minor aches and exhaustion following performances after decades of touring, but this time it persisted. He eventually went for a medical examination in November 2009, at the insistence of Wendy Dio, his manager and wife. Everything was devastated by the diagnosis. Late-stage stomach cancer is a cruel condition with a very poor prognosis if caught too late. This would have been the end for many. Dio, however, was never one to submit. He didn't curse his fate, he didn't despair, he didn't fear. Instead, with the attitude of a warrior, he charged into battle. Dio started chemotherapy at MD Anderson Cancer Center in Houston, Texas, as soon as he heard the news. He was exhausted by each treatment, yet he never allowed the illness to overcome him. Wendy Dio turned as his steadfast rock at this period. She made sure her husband stayed psychologically robust by giving him her whole attention. Geezer Butler, Tony Iommi, and numerous more co-workers came to visit often, showing their love and support. Yet, Dio's body kept getting weaker despite the numerous prayers and words of support that were offered. By the beginning of 2010, his health had gotten quite worse. He continued to interact with his supporters and attend events, but his former enthusiasm was waning. Dio had no choice but to accept the fact that Heaven and Hell would eventually have to postpone their planned tour. Dio continued to compose music, spend time with loved ones, and think back on his life in his last days. Even though he was aware that his time was running out, he faced it fearlessly. At the age of 67, Ronnie James Dio passed away at his Los Angeles, California, residence on May 16, 2010. Everyone in the heavy metal scene fell into mourning. It was difficult for friends, fans, and other musicians to believe that a voice as strong as his could ever be quiet. Tony Iommi also expressed his sorrow. Numerous iconic musicians and thousands of fans attended Dio's burial in May 2010. Death was not the end of his legacy, though, as the melody of his timeless melodies reverberated through the air, accompanied by raised fists flashing the devil horns above Los Angeles. Legacy and impact. Wendy Dio founded the Ronnie James Dio Stand Up and Shout Cancer Fund following Dio's death. A non-profit organization devoted to promoting research for improved therapies and increasing public awareness of stomach cancer. The fund is still an essential component of Dio's legacy and has raised millions of dollars. The Dio Disciples Festival, where metal musicians gather to perform and celebrate Dio's music, is one of the many tribute events that his closest friends have planned in his honor. Dio never really vanished in the eyes of his fans. His voice can still be heard in timeless tunes like Heaven and Hell, Rainbow in the Dark, and Holy Diver. Dio endures each time the devil horns are lifted during a performance. James Ronnie Dio was more than simply a vocalist. He was a warrior, a storyteller, and an indestructible soul. Dio always put up a fight, from his early days as a trumpet player in Cortland to his rise to prominence as one of the finest voices in heavy metal ever. Never giving up or settling for a predestined outcome. After creating masterpieces with Rainbow and bringing Black Sabbath back from the dead, he established his own Dio empire and gave the world timeless music. Heaven and Hell, Rainbow in the Dark, Holy Diver. Millions of followers throughout the world find inspiration in these tunes, which are more than just music, they are emblems of a time. Ronnie James Dio was never really gone. Every moment the Last in Line or Holy Diver's melodies or the devil horns erupt above the audience, Dio comes alive again, more powerful than before. He never really went, he battled until his last breath. All he did was become immortal. How about you? What is the Dio song that you remember the most? When did you realize how powerful his voice really was? Leave a comment with your ideas. And let's work together to preserve Dio's spirit. Remember to hit like and subscribe so that we may continue to tell you the storied tales of rock music.